Hi folks, Men of the Infinite here, coming to you from our new brother channel, Men of the Finite, which is designed to be for more topical matters, such as video responses here on YouTube, such as this one. This is a response to Veritas48, real name Noah, and his video purporting to be an argument for God called The Argument from Facts of Normativity. Now, I apologise for my voice in this video. I'm actually quite unwell at the moment, but I figured if I didn't do this now, the opportunity would pass me by, so apologies for that. And also apologies for the tone that I'll take at times in this response, because it doesn't have anything to do with Noah necessarily. I will be taking a slightly harsh tone at times because I confess to being a little bit weary of the sophistry that is Christian apologetics.
Alright, this is the first video in my Veritas48 challenge. And in this video I want to present an argument for the existence of God called the argument from Facts of Normativity. And it's a really simple argument for the existence of God. It's short, but I think it carries a lot of weight.
That would be because, like a lot of obese Westerners, it's chock full of crap. One of the things that's always slightly bemused me about the arguments that apologists make, and indeed all of the classical arguments for the existence of God, is that they don't seem to have much to do with God. All they really do is argue for some kind of nebulous state of affairs as some kind of necessary thing. And then somehow at the end of that, these apologists simply insert God into that nebulosity. But they seem to do it without any good reason. And I suspect it's because they don't have good reason.
This type of argument comes in the form of an inference to the best explanation. And in these types of cases, you have some set of data or facts that you're trying to explain and multiple rival explanations concerning those facts. And the idea is to establish that one of these explanations is better than the other alternatives. Now, I'm not making the claim that these other alternative explanations aren't possible, just that the one that I'm offering is superior. So I want to present some facts.
Well, I was hoping for some facts as well, but they weren't forthcoming. All you did was present a bunch of bald-faced assertions that you offered as facts, without making any kind of argument for their truth value or their factuality. And again, this is typical of apologetics.
So what is a normative fact? A normative fact essentially describes what ought to be the case. And these things become apparent in a couple different areas in the world. And the two we're going to look at in this video are ethics, or morality, and rationality. All right? When we look at morality as an enterprise, we notice immediately the idea of ethical obligations.
Whoa, hold that bus. What do you mean we immediately see? I would like to politely suggest at this point that you don't speak for me. We don't see any such thing. There is no such thing as moral obligation. The very term moral obligation is devoid of meaning. You will not find such a thing as moral obligation anywhere in the universe. Moral obligations do not exist, or at least they only exist in the form of a psychological tool that people employ to manipulate others. To whom or what could we possibly be obligated? In the case of the individual, you simply have moral ideas that are either expressed consistently and authentically or not. There's no point at which the concept of obligation enters the picture whatsoever. From a broader social point of view, there also is no such thing as obligation. What you have is imposition. You have agreed upon moral tenets that are imposed upon a population. This imposition does not obligate you in any way. It is merely an imposition. It's important to understand the difference between imposition and obligation. The fact is that even if God existed, God could not confer upon me or anyone any kind of obligation. I cannot be obligated by God. God can only impose.
Or ethical oughts, or moral oughts. A moral ought would be something like you ought not run over people with your car for fun. All right, that's a moral ought. Now, when something like this, when a moral ought is violated, you've done something immoral, right? I think we can all agree on that. That's pretty basic.
Yes, it is quite basic. In fact, it's a little too basic. I'm afraid giving a mundane example of a moral ought does not provide us with any insight into what a moral ought actually is, what the nature of a moral ought actually is. And yet that understanding of what moral oughts really consist of is absolutely critical to this entire argument. And yet at no stage in this entire argument did you bother to try and explain what a moral ought really is. So I'll do it for you. A moral ought is simply an expression of desire, or if you like, in a more Nietzschean sense, an expression of an individual's will to power. When you say that something ought be or ought not be, you are simply stating your preference for a particular state of affairs. You want things to be a certain way. A moral ought is nothing more sophisticated than an expression of what you want, of how you want a given state of affairs to be or to unfold.
When it comes to rationality, some states of mind are of the nature of being more reasonable than others. Now, if you disagree with this, all right, then you mustn't think that a young Earth creationist views are any less reasonable than that of a well-trained scientist. So be careful before denying this. I'll give you a more blatant example. If I have the state of mind right now that says that there's a computer monitor in front of me, and somebody comes up behind me and has a state of mind at the same time that there's a live elephant in front of me, the former is more reasonable than the latter state of mind. It's more rational than the latter. It's better than the latter. So another way to put this, certain states of mind are better than others, all right? And if you disagree with this, you're actually proving me right. Because if you disagree with the idea that some states of mind are more reasonable than others, then you're basically saying that that state of mind, yours, the one of disagreement with me, is more reasonable than mine and ought to be held. And that ends up proving my point. So paradoxically, if you agree with this, you see my point, and if you disagree with this, you've proven my point.
Now, I agree with all of that. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it was beautifully argued. It's just a pity that you couldn't keep that quality of logic going through the rest of the video.
Now, here's the problem, and I think this is a huge problem for people who do not think there is a God. You cannot get what ought to be the case from merely what is the case. If you're an atheist, especially one that believes that, the science is what uniformly informs us about reality, then you're going to have what you're going to have is a state of what merely is the case, a descriptive state of what merely is the case, not what ought to be the case. So the first issue is, if you're going to admit that there are oughts in both of these areas of morality and rationality, then atheism is in a tough spot, because atheism, especially the, Dawkinian, Thunderfoot, scientific version that stresses science and says that science is our guide to reality, this can only describe what is the case. It can't produce anything about what ought to be the case. There's normative impotency.
Well, I have to say that supposed normative impotency pales in comparison to the logical impotency of your supposed argument here. And I might just point out that the fact that you cannot derive an ought from an is hardly something that is new to any of us. It was, of course, Scottish philosopher David Hume that best laid out the argument for this idea. But from my point of view, it's actually fairly obvious that you cannot derive a notion of how things ought be from information about how things are. You speak as though this represents some kind of great challenge specifically for atheists, but I don't see where you get this sort of thinking from, because atheists quite evidently don't have any problem in deriving oughts. They don't have any problem whatsoever with holding and expressing particular ethical or even teleological viewpoints.
I mean, think about this with me. Where would an ought even come from? Where would an ought come from on this view? From organisms that merely examine what is?
What do you mean from organisms that merely examine what is? What the hell does that mean? Do you seriously think that encapsulates the nature of consciousness? You've got to be kidding. Anyway, I'll answer your question in part 2 of this response. See you then.